Good morning, everyone. How are you? I'm Roswell Encina, the Chief Communications Officer for the Library of Congress, and on behalf of the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, and the remarkable staff of the Library of Congress, we welcome you to the 2019 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I know there are a lot of stages out there that you could start your day at, but we're very happy that you're here at the genre fiction stage. Now, the festival has grown so much in the nearly 2 decades it started in 2001, when it started with nearly tens of thousands of people on the National Mall when it was launched by then First Lady Laura Bush. It's grown into what we've called our little Beyonce of book festivals, with more than 200,000 people coming here to the Washington Convention Center. We thank you enough for your genuine love for reading. We know the feeling when you're completely overwhelmed by a beautifully written text, when you have to savor each word or you have to read out loud each sentence. I know this happens to me all the time. So all day, we have more than 140 authors here at the National Book Festival. We're glad you're kicking it off here again here at the genre fiction stage, where we'll be presenting more than a dozen authors till 8 o'clock tonight. All are award winners and best-selling authors, including our first panel of authors. We appreciate all of you being here. To kick it off, we're going out west as we hear and honor 4 brilliant authors. We have Spur Award winner and Billington Award winner Paul Andrew Hutton, who will be discussing his book, The Apache Wars, The Hunt for Geronimo, the Apache Kid, and the Captive Boy, who started the longest war in American history. Spur Award winner Craig Johnson, who will be discussing his book, Death of Winter. Spur Award winner Anne Hillerman, who will be discussing her book, The Tale Teller, the Lee Porn Chi and Manuelito novel. And Western Writers of America winner Johnny D. Boggs, who will be talking about his book, The Kansas City Cowboys. Thank you again for being here, and welcome again to Johnny D. Boggs, Anne Hellerman, Paul Andrew Hutton, and Craig Johnson.
Thank you so much. We are delighted to be here, and we want to thank the Library of Congress, and we want to thank the National Book Festival for bringing us out from the provinces all the way back here to the center of power, world power, I guess. And we're absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm going to moderate the panel, and I'll try to then leave about 10, 15 minutes for questions at the end, if that works for everyone. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the organization we're all in, which is the Western Writers of America, which is now in its 7th decade, and is one of the earliest and most important writing organizations in America. Our president, Nancy Plain, is here, and right here in the very front row. Stand up, wave. There she is. And Nancy has copies of our magazine, The Roundup, which we are happy to give to you for free at the end of the session. She'll hold all those over here. Western women are strong, to say the least. Our roots go back. Before I introduce the panel, let me give you a little talk about Western writing. Our roots go back to, of course, Fenimore Cooper, who gave birth to the Western novel in 1823 with The Pioneers, writing, of course, about the Wild West of upstate New York. He followed that with, of course, the immortal Last of the Mohicans 3 years later. And the Western story was picked up then by almanac writers, dime novel writers, playwrights doing plays like Nick of the Woods and Lion of the West about Davy Crockett. And the West became an integral part, especially with the election of Andrew Jackson as president, an integral part of American life, and was seen as sort of not a replacement, but a follow-up to the Founding Fathers, and an idea that Americans could achieve anything through determination and hard work and individualism. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner, a young professor at the University of Wisconsin, gave a paper in Chicago at the American Historical Association meeting. No one went because everyone was in Chicago to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was playing across the street at the World's Fair. But Turner gave a little talk called the Frontier Thesis, and that actually founded my field, the academic field of Western history. Turner said that American exceptionalism, not that we were better than others, although he believed that, but that we were different from others, different especially from Europe, came from the frontier environment and the frontier experience. In 1902, that talented Harvard dude, Owen Wister, made the cowboy into the quintessential American hero. He had a little help from Buffalo Bill, from Teddy Roosevelt, who became the cowboy president, even though he was, of course, from New York and went to Harvard, and artists like Frederick Remington. And a year after Owen Wister's The Virginian was published about a Wyoming cowboy in 1902, Edwin S. Porter released his little film, The Great Train Robbery, the first American film to tell a story. And off we went to the races. Soon a new industry had been created, and Western films made up 1/3 of all the Hollywood product in the first 60 years of the film industry. The stunning commercial success of authors like Max Brand and Zane Grey inspired a host of lesser talents who filled the pulp magazine trade. But there was also Stephen Crane and Ernest Haycox, Eugene Mandel of Rhodes, Walter Van Tilburg Clark, Dorothy Johnson, Marie Sandos, Willa Cather, John Neihart, A.B. Guthrie, a string of novelists who added immeasurably to the American canon. And this was the great age of print, of course, and the Western thrived, not only in print, but on film. And so in 1953, 3 writers who had noticed the sort of shift from pulps to paperback fiction with the creation of the pocketbook during World War II, created a new organization. It was called the Western Writers of America. And they quickly moved into television writing because television, of course, took off dramatically right at that very same time. And it's hard to believe, with only 3 networks, but there were 40 primetime television shows by 1959. Just primetime Western television shows. So it was Westerns, and Westerns. You couldn't get enough Westerns. And of course, television killed, the Western book business. It was rescued briefly by Louis L'Amour, who had incredible success and still, of course, outsells many of our modern authors on the paperback racks of airports. But we've seen in recent years, as genre fiction, like L'Amour wrote, died out, we've seen the rise of again, serious Western fiction, and not that L'Amour wasn't serious, in books by Larry McMurtry, of course, Lonesome Dove, and its incredible success. Stephen Ambrose with his success with Undaunted Courage, S.C. Gwynne, Empire of the Summer Moon, on it goes. There's so many authors writing great fiction and nonfiction, and the success of Lonesome Dove and Dances with Wolves helped to bring back the Western film. The Western Writers of America has sort of adapted to these changes in the field, and we're proud that we're not simply Louis L'Amour, Max Brand, Zane Grey genre fiction anymore, that we've moved out. But our stories are always human stories about the West, stories about the land, stories about people, a place of harshness and beauty and incredible diversity, a place that shaped the American psyche and still continues to fire the world's imagination. The Western story is indeed the story of America. Well, the authors here today all celebrate that story, and let me, even though they need no introduction, let me introduce them to you. Ann Hillerman of Santa Fe in the middle is, of course, an award-winning author. In our business, we say Spur Award-winning author because the Western Writers of America gives the Spur Award for the in several categories for writing. And Ann won that for her debut novel, Spider-Woman's Daughter, which followed the further adventures of the characters that her father, Tony Hillerman, had created and made famous, Jim Chee, Joe Leaphorn. And she has, of course, followed up with a series of novels that have become New York Times bestsellers and established quite a name for herself, separate from her father's great record. The fifth novel in that series, The Tale Teller, released in April 2019, brings legendary Lieutenant Joe Leaphorn back into the world of her very successful books. Equally successful is Craig Johnson, Wyoming Cowboy, and who lives in the town of Ucross, Wyoming, population 35. All of us from the west here. I'm from New Mexico, and of course so is Ann and so is Johnny. But all of us are just kind of amazed that there are so many people. We haven't seen this many people in our How do you folks get around? This is crazy.
There are as many people in one given mile of I-95 as there are in all of Wyoming. I'm pretty sure about that.
Oh yeah. Well, in New Mexico, we think we have urban sprawl compared to Wyoming. when you got more pronghorns than you got people, it's a pretty interesting place. Of course, Craig is famous for his Longmire series of novels, which have been brought to television by now on Netflix and incredibly successful. And of course, he is also a Spur Award-winning novelist. The latest in the series is Land of Wolves. Johnny D. Boggs of Santa Fe is a prolific writer of novels, of juvenile fiction, of short stories, of nonfiction. He is an 8-time winner of the Western Writers of America Spur Award, which is a record. No one has won that many. And many of us who toil in the vineyards are kind of bitter about that. But we brought him here anyway, because we like his hat. By the way, you'll notice that my colleagues are all dressed Western, and I am a college professor, so I have worn my college professor outfit. I teach at the University of New Mexico. Let me get that plug in. Yeah. You've never heard of our football team, I know. And you never will. Johnny's latest book is an unusual Western about a baseball team, and it's called the Kansas City Cowboys. First, I wanted to ask the panelists about how they see themselves fitting into the Western as a genre, and how that genre has changed and how they have adapted to those changes, which have been really dramatic over the last 20 years. Craig, can we start with you?
Woo. Where do we fit in?
Okay, I've got easier questions.
No, I'm gonna give it a try at that one. I just got a little run up to it. That's all. I guess. For me, I guess the big question I always get asked is where do you come up with the ideas of doing a series of books about the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state in America. And I got to be honest, where that came from was I actually ran into 2 detectives for the Division of Criminal Investigation there in Wyoming, where we have one crime lab in the entire state down in Cheyenne, and it's in an old grocery store. And I ran into these 2 guys. I got out on the Powder River one time, and I said, how long does it, because this was whenever the CSI thing craze was really, every other, you talk about the 40 Westerns that were on television, it was like every other show was CSI Hoboken or CSI, whatever. And so I asked these 2 guys, these 2 detectives there in Wyoming, I said, how long does it take you guys to get DNA evidence? Because it seems like they get it, in 2 minutes on these TV shows, right? And so they looked at each other, and the one looks at me and says, well, is this a high-profile case? And I said, well, let's pretend like it is. And he goes, about 6 months. And I was like, okay, so that's not particularly honest than what they're doing in these TV shows and in these books and everything. A little bit of a deus ex machina, and he goes, yeah, it's not very real at all. And so I thought, well, if you did something that, went in the opposite direction like that, and I'd done a lot of ride-alongs and spent time with a lot of these sheriffs in Wyoming and Montana, and it seemed like if I tried to do something that was more character and place-based, that was going to be more fun, because I'm not a complete Luddite. I don't hate, technology, even though I've got a Wyoming sheriff who doesn't know how to use a cell phone like that. But for me, like it's always going to be much more interesting to have character and place, because I can read about that, for days, like and never get bored. I really love the characters. I really love, the location. That's always going to give me a lot more to work with, like and I think that kind of became the hallmark, I think, for the series and for me as a writer.
And I think that is really sort of characteristic of novels about the West. I mean, I know when my dad started his series back in 1970, it was really revolutionary because it was the first time that major readers who weren't just in the Southwest were attracted to a Native American detective who was spending lots of time just driving in his car and thinking and talking about the beautiful country he was driving through. So when I decided to continue the series, I mean, I was blessed with sort of that Western tradition of characters who stand on their own. I mean, half the cell phones don't work in New Mexico anyway because there aren't enough towers and there's too many mountains. So I wasn't troubled with having to integrate a lot of technology. But I was really delighted to be able to write about wonderful characters who care not only about the law, but at a deeper sense about what justice is, and who also are really part of the landscape in which they live. I know for the Navajo people, and for your characters too, the landscape is really sacred, and it has kind of formed who they are, and they're most comfortable living in this kind of beautiful, empty country. And I think that has always been sort of part of the Western novel tradition. So that's my 2 cents.
Johnny, you actually write genre fiction sometimes.
Well, yeah.
Along with many other things, which won you.
It's called a mortgage.
8 squirrels.
So you asked me to write anything, and I'll probably do it. But I think, I'm originally from South Carolina, and I moved out west as a newspaper journalist, and you just meet all these interesting and kind of stubborn and very independent people, and I always thought it was, if you grow up watching Gunsmoke, you have this idea of what the West is, and then when you actually live out there and you realize it's incredibly diverse, and it can be a really hard place to live, and you learn about the land, and you can really kind of appreciate the land as a character, and it's a great character, but it can turn on you really fast, and you've got to be respectful and aware of that all the time.
Well, let's talk a little about that. I was thinking, Craig, when you're talking about DNA, like when Marshall Dillon was on television on Gunsmoke, the idea of DNA evidence was that he would get off his horse and see how fresh the
Tracks were.
Well, I wasn't going to say tracks, but I was trying to think of how to talk
clean you up
about
here,
what the
Paul.
horse left behind as it moved along. But
Road apples. is what
thank you
they're-
very much. See, up in Wyoming, they know these things. That was DNA evidence. And well, landscape really is. You all mentioned landscape, and landscape is always a major character. And you think about the great Western films, certainly John Ford. I mean, landscape is an integral part of the story, and it's integral to all of your stories, really integral to all of your stories. Craig, how does landscape work for you? And you work with a kind of very different landscape than Anne does, for instance.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that it's interesting like that, but there is. I was thinking about what Johnny was saying about like Gunsmoke, because I made the remark last night, like that. John Ford kind of made everybody think that the entire West looks like Monument Valley. The entire West does not look like Monument Valley, or parts of it that do. But I don't know. For me, the big thing is that it's not only a social and technological frontier. It kind of goes a little bit back to also, what John was saying too, like that. I mean, it's an interesting place to write about because things can go wrong so quickly, like that. And then there's nothing that's more limited than, we all kind of like go through our lives with this idea that technology is the answer for everything. And then, I can always tell whenever somebody's not from, the West or not from Wyoming, when they come up to me and they go, "Why doesn't Walt carry a cell phone?" And I'm always like, "You've never been to Wyoming, have you?" Because unless you're just going to take selfies, with the pronghorn antelope, it's really not going to be much use, So, for me, that it's always going to be. There's that great quote by Studs Terkel where he said, "Nothing ever happened nowhere." you know, and you always have to be aware, I think, you know, certainly, you know, whenever you're writing Westerns, of just exactly what kind of an environment that you're talking about, like that. I mean, you know, where I live, like that, I mean, literally, you know, my town has 25 people in it, like that, and, you know, in the Bighorn Mountains are, you know, about the size of Rhode Island, like that, for gosh sakes, like that, and there isn't a ranching family that I know that hasn't had at least one family member, one ancestor or something who wandered off to go feed some cows or went to go check some fence and never came back, you know, that just kind of disappeared like that. And so every once in a while, it's kind of nice to remind ourselves, you know, that that's a big world out there. And, you know, we're just a very, very small part of it.
You know, though, when you read your novels, Craig, it would seem that the homicide rate would be why everyone disappears up in northern Wyoming.
Now, you have to draw a comparison here. Now, are you talking about the TV show where they kill, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 people a week, like that, or are you talking about my books? What I did was, very quickly, I kind of came to the conclusion that this is going to be ludicrous, like, you know, or, you know, I thought, man, you know, like, Absaroka County is murder capital USA, like. And so what I did was, it just kind of seemed to make sense to me, because if you ever noticed in these mystery novels, always these protagonists, they're always solving cases and breaking all these cases, and nobody ever notices, you know, they just continue doing their quiet little job wherever they're doing it. And so after the first, you know, couple of books, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna have to like widen Walt's jurisdiction and have him going out, you know, into other counties, you know, and other states. So I would take him up into Montana, over into South Dakota. Like, I even took him all the way back to Philadelphia, for goodness sake, like that. And it gave me the opportunity to write one of my favorite lines. Walt was at Fairmount Park watching the fountains spray water into the air, and his statement was, like the humidity needed any help. And if one more person called him Tex, you know, in Philadelphia, like, he was going to strangle somebody like that. But yeah, I mean, you know, you got to kind of spread it out a little bit at that point in time. I thought, okay, you know, and people would. I mean, if you had a sheriff, you know, in a state that has only 24 counties, like it, then if you had a guy who was breaking those cases, then he would get invited. You know, there would be other sheriffs that would say, hey, I've got a little problem over here, you know, how about come and help me out with this? I mean, the Hollywood version is always, hey, that's our turf, that's our jurisdiction. Generally, that's not the way law enforcement works. You know, generally, everybody's in the foxhole like that, you know, and if you got somebody who can help you, then they'd try and help you. And I witnessed that with a Wyoming sheriff like in Johnson County, who was going to go and do an investigation out on the Powder River. And he was talking to the sheriff over in Campbell County. And I was listening very carefully to the conversation, see how he was going to approach this. And he said, yeah, I'd like to come over and ask a few people in that town a couple of questions and stuff like that. And there was a long pause. And he knew I was listening, like, and he covered up the receiver and he goes, he says he'll pay for my gas. Like, and so...
Well, Anne benefits from the fact that she lives in my state, New Mexico, and our homicide rate really is astonishing. So it's not quite all fictional. And your landscape really is Monument Valley, essentially.
Yeah, it really
and
is.
Right next door to it.
In fact, in my second book, I was able to invent a movie company that's actually working in Monument Valley. And after, I had never written a novel before I wrote Spider-Woman's Daughter, so I was pretty full of myself after that first novel came out. I thought, well, now I've got this down, and I'm going to have my 2 main characters solving a crime together, right? People love that model. But my main character did not love that model, so I worked on that Monument Valley book, which I thought was going to be so brilliant, for about 2 months, and I could barely read it myself. It was so awful. And finally, it dawned on me, as beautiful as Monument Valley was, that the woman who I had raised up from a sidekick to being a main crime solver was done being a sidekick, and she needed her own story. And I always thought it was just kind of a writer's myth that your characters talk to you and, you know, tell you. But when your characters don't talk to you, then you are in trouble. So anyway, I figured out, I gave her her own story, and I was able to write about Monument Valley and movie companies. And I have to say, it's wonderful to live where you get to do research, which involves long road trips and just kind of being out under the beautiful blue sky and enjoying that country. And then, like Paul does, doing the research up for the background of it. So you have a little something to say while your characters are trying to figure out what to do next. So yeah, I love Monument Valley, and I'm glad the West doesn't all look like it, because there are so many other settings too that are wonderful to write about.
Of course, in the Hollywood movies, everything's Southern California, no matter where you are. Dodge City, Kansas, Tombstone, it's Southern California. Johnny, landscape is an integral part of your stories, and it kind of informs them in the same way that Craig and Ann's stories
Right.
use it.
And I'm right. I'm not set any particular time period or any particular setting. So I'll move all over from Montana to pre-Revolutionary War South Carolina, which was the West at that time in the backcountry. And you learn. I mean, I watched the movie The Patriot. Remember that with Mel Gibson, who we really don't want to mention ever again. But and I was watching it, and it's set in South Carolina, and it's based on actual history. And I said, where are the mosquitoes? I'm from there. I mean, they're the size of ravens. And you got to get that. And years ago, I got invited on a cattle drive. I was doing a magazine story, and they asked me, hey, you want to come up and it was for a ranching family, and they said, well, we're doing our spring cattle drive. You want to come up and ride with us? Asking a Western rider if he wants to go on a cattle drive. Yeah, sure. It was like a 4-day trip in Arizona, and when I got home, I had to replace my glasses because the dust scratched them so much. You know, it's a $300 pair of glasses for a $200 story. But you learn about the character, and I always thought the best fiction is when the setting is part of the character, whether it's Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles or Dickens' London and places like that, where you can really get a feel for that. And it really does shape who your characters are and where they belong.
$300 pair of glasses, I guess all those spur awards, you don't go to like the chain stores, you don't go to Walmart to get your glasses like college professors have to. Is that how it works?
Apparently you haven't bought glasses in a long time, Paul.
Native peoples form an integral part of the West, and of course, certainly of all of the writers that we have here, including myself. And dealing with native stories, Indian stories, I mean, we call it Indian country. Indian people call themselves Indians. Usually they call themselves what they are, Navajos, Apaches, Shoshones, Arapahoes. But both of your stories and many of Johnny's novels are all set in Indian country. And of course, and your stories are just intricately dealing with Native peoples all the time. You have to have a certain sensitivity, but also, I mean, you're writing novels, so you've got to have drama, you've got to have a story, and how do you deal with that sort of touchy problem?
Well, I think first of all, you got to give credit where credit's due. Like, and a lot of people forget that Ann's dad, when he first started writing this series of books, that was 1968. That was not a period in time when it was cool to be Indian, okay? I mean, things have changed a lot, since 1968. But for him to start a series of books that had two native protagonists who were the detectives, and the best description I ever heard was Wes Studi. Was one time doing a speech about Tony's books, and he had actually appeared. I think it was in the PBS version of Tony's books. And he said, what was so great was as an Indian reading these books, and there were two Tontos, and the Lone Ranger never showed up. And I don't know, for me, that story kind of touches, and your response, kind of touches on one of my favorite aspects of it, is that I don't think there's ever been a group of individuals that's ever been more maligned as the Native American as not having a sense of humor. I mean, really, it's like one of the easiest ways to demean a group of people is by saying they don't have the high functions of humor, for goodness sake. And I'm always laughing about that because that ain't the Indians that I know. And I do say Indians, I don't say Native Americans, because my Cheyenne buddies make fun of me when I try and be politically correct. When I try and say Native American, they always look at me and go, where were you born? And I'm like, yeah. I was born in America. So you would be a Native American too then, wouldn't you? So But it's the folks that I know, like they work on about 17 different layers of irony, and if you're not aware of that irony, you get to be the butt of that irony. And so, for me, it's like it's just a big question of making sure that these people are not just they're not just backdrop. They're not just just there as set dressing like that. That they're human beings. They're very complex human beings. A very complex culture. And whenever you're approaching it, from the outside of that culture, I mean, these people are my neighbors. These are my friends, practically some of them family. And so I have to be very careful, when I'm dealing with them. I'm sure that, that Ann feels the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one precedent that my dad set when he started the series that I have now broken was that the bad guy was always a non-native person. One time he had, I think, a Cherokee who was the bad guy. But you always, if you were reading, if you
or as my friend Marcus Red Thunder refers to it, generic-y.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so readers kind of caught on to that pretty quick, and they would limit the suspects for who could be the bad guy. So in the book that just came out, I actually had a Navajo being the bad guy. And I had good reaction from my Navajo readers saying, we always loved your dad's books, but we thought that was a little too predictable. So it's kind of nice to see see that you're telling the whole story. Another thing, and I know you deal with this in your books too, and I'm sure Johnny has, are all of the social problems that plague Indian country.
Right.
The alcoholism, the domestic violence, the poverty, and all of the contingent cloud around that. So when you're writing, I'm writing novels, I'm not writing social commentary, but it's kind of nice to be able to use a little bit of that to tell the whole story of the contemporary West, which is the devastation caused by broken families and boarding schools and the whole disrespectful behavior that the American government had toward Native people. But I don't want to get too heavy. And what you're saying about humor is really good. In the book that I just finished, I have there's a dog involved, and the dog's adopted by the Navajo family. And so they say, what are you going to call the dog? And they're calling the dog Come Here in Navajo.
It's too much to work with. There was I was talking to Marcus, and I guess in the Crow tribe, a son-in-law is not allowed to talk to his mother-in-law. And so we went over to go visit some people like that. And so, the mother was talking to the dog and saying, I have to go to the clinic later today. So if you know anybody that's going into town, make sure that they're at 2:00, they can give me a ride into town. And then the grandson, the son-in-law is talking to the dog too. He's like, well, I'm going to have the car ready to go around 2:00. And I am so dying to write that scene. It's just taking the enamel off my teeth, I swear. So.
One more sign of the superiority of native culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not allowed to talk to your
problem
mother-in-law.
out before it happens.
Never thought I'd be doing mother-in-law jokes at the National Festival, but boom. Johnny, baseball is the theme of, to kind of change gears, baseball is the theme of two of your novels, including your latest, and I happen to know you are a baseball fanatic.
I'm a baseball.
So you have managed to weave that in, but there is a historical basis.
There is, and the Kansas City Cowboys is about a 16-year-old phenomenal pitcher who really wants to be a real working cowboy, and he winds up playing for the Kansas City Cowboys, which in 1886 was the westernmost National League team in baseball. And the myth is that they were expelled from the league after one season for hooliganism. So I just wanted to take some various themes of baseball and Western fiction and kind of merge them into one where the can becomes a pitcher's wind-up, and the love interest is, instead of the rancher's daughter, it's the daughter of the owner of the baseball team, and just kind of mix it up and kind of turn both baseball and with the Western tropes on their ears. And we'll see actually how that works. And there's a little bit of, someone kind of said, man, there's a lot of profanity in that, in your novel. And I was like, you have never managed a team of 13-year-old boys.
Well, Johnny, we're certainly all hoping that this innovative novel does not win you a ninth spur. And you've also done, I don't believe this is unusual, but it certainly is different from your other books. You've done a picture book, a photography book, Tony Hillerman's Country. And how was that? And of course, you worked with your husband, who is a renowned photographer.
That book, when I did that book, my background was journalism, and I was totally happy doing nonfiction books. So when I did that book, partly in honor of my dad, and partly from my own curiosity, a lot of the places that he wrote about in the Navajo world I had never been to. So my husband and I spent a couple years driving here and there, talking to people, taking thousands of photos. And then, interestingly, when Dad died, at first I was really missing him. Well, I'm still missing him, but I was profoundly missing him. But because of this book, I got a lot of invitations to do free, and I had never done any talks, to do free talks at little libraries. And whenever I would do those talks, people, I'd say, does anybody have any questions? And there always would be questions if there were going to be any more books in that series. And no, there weren't. My dad really took care of business before he left us. And after I heard that maybe 100 times, it dawned on me that besides missing my dad, I was really missing those stories too. And having done that nonfiction book and reread all of my dad's books, his voice and the voice of the characters was really strongly in my head. And all of the wonderful people I had met doing the research for that book then became resources to me as I was doing more research for my first novel. So, life is just so fascinating, and it gives us such gifts. And I really saw doing that book as a gift from the universe to help me then make the bridge to putting on my big girl boots and writing fiction. So thank you for asking me that question. That book, I feel like that book is my first baby. I love that book.
Well, of course, we all know that nonfiction writing is the most important kind of writing. The book is The Apache Wars, Crown published. Doing pretty well. We all dream, and I certainly did with The Apache Wars, but it hasn't quite worked out, although it almost did. We all dream of going to Hollywood, big movie, television series made about our book. And you kind of hinted at this already, Craig. But how has the television series impacted the way you're writing your series, or has it at all?
It hasn't really impacted the writing that much, simply because I had I guess it was 7 books in the Walt Longmire series out, like that, before the television show started. But it has, it sometimes does have an effect in your life like that, because there was one time we were going on tour, and we were driving up to Billings, Montana, to jump on a plane. And my wife was with me, and she knows that traveling with me is like traveling with a trained bear. As long as the bear stays fed, we're okay. But if the bear gets hungry, then things could kind of go sideways. And so we stop at this little cafe outside Red Lodge, Montana, and we're having lunch. And I go over and I'm paying for lunch. And when I'm not wearing one of these, I'm wearing one of those Absaroka County Sheriff's Department ball caps that we have. They've got an emblem on the front, and mine's kind of weathered down and everything. And if you didn't know there was no 24th County in Wyoming, if you didn't know there was no Absaroka County, they look pretty real, right? So I've got that one on, and I'm writing the check for lunch, and the woman behind the counter goes, "Where'd you get that hat?" And she said it real aggressive, and I thought, oh no, she thinks I'm a real sheriff's deputy, and somebody's dined and ditched, and I'm gonna have to go chase somebody down the main street of Red Lodge. And so I pointed at my head and I go, "It's not a real county." And she goes, "The hell it's not, it's Walt Longmire's county." So I felt like I'd been smacked, and so I looked at her and I go, "Well, I'm Craig Johnson." And she goes, "So?" I said, "Well, I'm the guy that writes the books." And she goes, "What books?" And that's when that little voice in the back of my head said, "You should just get out of here. should just salvage whatever, remnants of, that you've got and just get out of here. My pride wouldn't let me do it. And I said, well, the books that the TV show is based on. And she looks at me, and I'll never forget her response. She's like, there are books? Okay. So I told Viking Penguin, I was like, that's going to be our motto from now on. Everywhere I go, yes, there are books.
Very good. I guess when the legend becomes fact, we really do print the legend.
Wear the ball cap.
Well, I guess it's a gift that Hollywood didn't pick up my book.
Oh, you look good in a ball cap, Paul.
In fact, in the West, you're going to see a lot more ball caps. You're going to see cowboy hats. It really is. Most cowboys, have some post Sox hat on for the most part. The West, many of Western novels, the best Western novels, obviously the panelist novels, have a kind of a dark undercurrent, and the story of the West always carries this dark undercurrent. And but ultimately, the West is also incredibly optimistic. And how do you, this is something I'm wrestling with in the new book I'm writing, which is a big history of the Western movement from the Revolution to 1900. And how do you deal with both the darkness, the tragedy, the horror, but then also the joy, the beauty, and the optimism that is ultimately the Western story?
Well, one of the gifts of writing in the mystery genre is that you have the box in which your story has to lie. And part of that box is that whatever awful thing has happened, your characters figure out what it was, and if they don't make things right, at least they find the bad guy and take care of that, and then your characters go on to solve another crime. And I think that in itself is kind of optimistic. And I think in a world where there are so many loose ends and so many things that kind of leave us saying what happens next, the sort of optimism of the mystery genre is that, yeah, the book is done, the story is done. In the next book, I'll get to see these characters again. So I think that's kind of part of why writing that, and that kind of goes with the West. I mean, I think the West often was a place where people came to reinvent themselves. Things weren't going quite right, and so you came out. Maybe you were the Henri daughter who didn't want to go to finishing school or whatever. So you came out to the West, and you set up your own place, and you made something of yourself. And I think that kind of thread of optimism is really something that sustains our books. We love those kind of characters who, kind of land on their feet no matter what sort of things are thrown at them. And you get into the dark stuff, but part of the skill, I think, of writing those mysteries is working that out. So by the end of the story, all is well, or at least it's better than when the story started.
I actually went west to reinvent myself, truly, and then had to do it like 2 more times in the West. But anyway, we have about 10 more minutes, and so I wondered if you had any questions from the audience. There are microphones there, if you would go to them, to ask your question. I'm a college professor. If no one gets up, I'll call on you. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Mr. Johnson, I was wondering, was there any particular Indian you had in mind for the character of Henry Standing Bear?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite quotes on writing is the one from Wallace Stegner, where he talks about the greatest piece of fiction ever written is the disclaimer at the beginning of every book that says nobody in this book is based off anybody alive or dead. What a crock that is. I mean, anybody ever approaches this job knows that that's what you do. You got to, find people. It just makes your life a lot easier. And the other thing is it's kind of a nice, catch guard like that, for the native characters. I mean, I can go down the list of all of the native characters that are in my books and give you the exact equivalency of who it is. Lonnie Littlebird is Charles Little Old Man, and obviously, Dina Mennicamps is a good friend of ours. Mandy Smoker brought us and then Henry is this good friend of mine, Marcus Red Thunder, who is just an amazing individual. His spirituality and his sense of humor is just astounding. And I just, you'd be a fool, to not, take those people and put them in your books like that, and then of course change the names to protect the guilty. But other than that, it's too much of an opportunity like that. So,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I have a son-in-law who is Kiowa, which I had never heard of that tribe until my son-in-law popped along, and you, Mr. Johnson, wrote some Kiowa natives into your story, and I didn't realize there was a presence outside of Oklahoma. Are there a lot of Kiowa up there?
no, not so much but they do. Yeah, the fun thing about our job is like, of course, like that we get to like lay on the sofa by the wood burning stove and read. And then when my wife says, "Are you going to do anything?" I can say, "I'm working here. I'm doing research." Okay, and Ann probably has the same situation there.
Yeah,
Johnny does too.
yeah,
Look at,
yeah,
but it
yeah.
may not look.
And bring
I
me a
think
beer
your
while
dad
you're
was
at it.
pretty famous for that, wasn't he? Like, he had a really famous quote about that. It was like, "It's almost absolutely impossible to discern exactly when I am and when I am not working." Like, that's a talent, I think. That's a real talent to have.
Definitely.
And we need another season of Longmire on Netflix. And
Hey,
that's going to happen?
tell Warner Brothers and Netflix and get on to them there. Like, let them know.
And your son-in-law does speak to you. Yes.
I know we're in the genre fiction room, but I wonder if the panel would comment on the idea that the Western ethos actually informs a much wider group of fiction and nonfiction. And I'm thinking about anything from the Seven Samurai becoming the Magnificent Seven, and Elmore Leonard starting as a Western writer and then becoming the foremost crime writer of his generation. Would you agree that the Western genre is really a much bigger influence on fiction and nonfiction?
That sounds like you, John.
That sounds like me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Seven Samurai is a much better movie than The Magnificent Seven.
Both versions.
Both, yeah, absolutely, and especially all the sequels. But yeah, I mean, you think about how much Western mythology and Western culture has spread all over the world. I mean, you wear a cowboy hat, and oh yeah, you're from the West, and when one of our presidents says, wanted dead or alive and things like that. I mean, and wanted dead or alive is a myth. I mean, yeah, you can't do that in the West or anywhere else. I mean, wanted dead or alive is illegal. I mean, trials come first. Convictions come first, and then maybe you can kill somebody. But that's all kind of hyperbole and crazy. And when you start researching, you realize, wait a minute, all this stuff is not right. But I think the West is iconic, and it's something that's known worldwide. And even if it is Monument Valley in Kansas, we understand what we're talking about, and we certainly love all things Western, and I think the whole world loves everything Western.
Johnny, don't spoil the beauty of a thing with fact. I was, just a personal story to that point, I was the historical consultant on the Western epic Cowboys and Aliens. It's why those aliens look so good. I went down to Roswell. I got to see it. Well, anyway, an integral part of the story is a wanted poster with a picture of a hero on it. Well, and I had to inform Jon Favreau, the director, well, John, there were no such wanted posters. There was no printing technology to put a picture on a poster at the time period your Western is set. And he said, that's too bad. And yes, sir. One more question.
Powder River. Mr. Johnson, I was wondering, love the books, but obviously a Wyoming Cowboy fan, and I've always wondered why Walt would go to USC to play his college football.
Why did Walt go to USC to play football? It was the 60s. I don't know. I mean, Walt was like, because I mean, one of the things that the TV people asked me like that was, they said, why is Walt as big as he is? Because, in the books, Walt's like 6'5" and weighs like, 257 pounds like that. And, he was an offensive lineman, for USC. He was a Marine investigator, all of these things like that. But the biggest thing was I knew what I was going to do to him. I knew that, I was going to beat him up, horribly like that, at least in every other book. Like, and so I thought, okay, he better have some longevity. He better be of a pretty good size like it. And so he was actually, probably one of the best, offensive linemen in the 1960s coming out of high school like it. And so one of the real powerhouse teams at that point in time was USC like it. And so I thought, okay, he's been in Wyoming all the way through high school. Like, it's time for him to go ahead and get out of there like it. And I thought, it's the 60s, probably Southern California probably looked pretty good to him like that. And so I've got this image in the back of my head that's going to come to fruition maybe in one of the later books, because after his experiences in Vietnam, the provost marshal for the Marine Corps kind of ships him off to Johnston Atoll to get rid of him, which is this rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean like that. And so Walt actually surfed a little bit in the 1960s like that. And so whenever he got out of Vietnam like that, he kind of went back to a little bit of surfing out there at Johnston Atoll. And so it just makes for, I guess more layers for that character like that. And then, of course, with the predominant wind that they have down there in Laramie, I didn't want Walt to have that constant kind of lean to him like that, So I figured I'd chip him off somewhere else. Like, yeah, but,
Thank you so much for coming. Thank the authors.